Good evening, Western Standard viewers, and welcome to Hannaford, a weekly politics show. It is Thursday, November the 13th. Here's a factoid for you. The government of Canada wants Alberta's oil sands companies to produce oil without increasing the amount of carbon in the atmosphere. You probably knew that, and you knew it as net zero emissions then, the so-called emissions cap. This costs a lot of money and is a competitive handicap for Alberta oil, a severe one, actually. In the Prime Minister's mind, this is decarbonized oil that we make here, and if any new pipelines are built out west, it is decarbonized oil that they'll be carrying. However, it's not the same for Eastern Canadian refineries importing oil from other countries. There is no equivalent added cost. Now, I find this unbelievable, but apparently it is so. There are two energy economies in Canada, one based on expensive oil out west, the other on cheap oil. With me today is Dr. Ron Wallace, who served on the old National Energy Board that the Liberals got rid of, by proposing to modernize it. You're the first professional ecologist appointed to the National Energy Board. We have a long career in energy regulation, and in fact, last month, Dr. Wallace, you were testifying to the Parliamentary the Standing Committee on Energy about this. Welcome, Ron.
Thank you.
Ron, this sounds outrageous, but I'm drawing my understanding of it from an article that you published recently in C2C Journal. And that said, you laid it out all in broad terms. They don't pay a premium in the East to import oil. We pay a premium in the West to produce it. What is going on here?
Well, this is a situation that's developed since the last election and been brought to a head by Prime Minister Carney's reference to what he called decarbonized oil. It wasn't something that was raised during the election, but it's come up since then. And I have some figures here, is that since 1988, marine terminals along the St. Lawrence have seen imports of foreign oil valued at more than $228 billion.
Yes.
And these are And that's not including the Irving Oil Refinery in New Brunswick, which between 1988 and 2020 imported $136 billion worth of oil. Now, there's two things here. First, none of that oil is, quotes, decarbonized. It's originating from the United States.
Can you just explain? I mean, I don't think people necessarily believe me. Decarbonized oil, what makes oil attractive is carbon. So, like dehydrated water, what do they mean?
Dehydrated water is a good example. What they're saying is that this is an attempt to limit the emissions that are going to the atmosphere in Canada. And so the idea behind decarbonized oil is that oil sands production will, the emissions from oil sands production will be captured and sequestered in the ground. And this is an attempt to ensure that Canada moves towards, it'll never reach net zero, but that it'll theoretically move towards producing more oil, but maintaining or reducing the emissions in Canada. And so what you're doing is you're capturing these emissions from these oil sands producing facilities, recompressing them and re-injecting them into geological formations underground.
But this happens under a very, very high pressure, requires pipe manufactured to extreme specifications.
Well,
and costs a hell of a lot of money.
It's a great deal of money. It's the minimum estimate so far that industry has spent through the Pathways Project, a reported $1 billion just on the basic engineering so far.
Okay, for people who don't follow the energy industry as closely as you do, the Pathways Alliance...
The Pathways Alliance has been established by the big oil sands producers, 4 of them, to construct a facility to capture these emissions and inject them underground.
Now they're already doing that in Weyburn, Saskatchewan, I believe, and not Pathways. Somebody.
Well, that's a different situation. In Weyburn, what's doing on is called EOR, enhanced oil recovery, where they're capturing emissions from coal facilities and they're re-injecting those underground to pressurize wells to bring more oil to the ground. And they've produced a lot of oil by doing this. That wouldn't normally be productive. Now, the government doesn't like this because you're adding oil to the equation. And in fact, what has happened is that the government of Canada has specifically set out tax relief for companies that can decarbonize or capture emissions, but they specifically excluded EOR from those tax regulations.
I see.
So they're two different situations.
So to be clear, Weyburn demonstrates that you can compress carbon dioxide and force it underground
and produce oil.
But it's for the way you're talking about it, it sounds like it's a sort of a high school chemistry experiment in scale compared to what you would have to do to bury carbon dioxide sufficient to...
Very much so. Well, the major difference between what's being proposed at Pathways is there is no oil recovery. You're just simply taking all that carbon from those emissions, pumping it underground, it's gone. In Weyburn, at least, their cost is being offset by the production of the oil. So when you build a plant that's going to cost $16 to $24 billion, you then have to operate that facility. And the operating costs are not covered in that $16 billion. It's estimated that those operating costs could be as much as $1.4 billion a year, every year.
So what would that do to the cost of the oil that's produced that
way?
Well,
precisely. So when
we're an export market, we've got to sell against the world.
We've got to sell against the world. Nobody else is doing this. Now, let's just start a little bit further back. This idea of an emissions cap, which is now apparently in play, there's no other country in the world that is doing that to its oil producers. Not one. Canada is an outlier in this, as I explained to the Standing Committee to the House. Not even Norway, which is pursuing injection facilities for carbon to inject the emissions underground, is doing that for its oil industry. It has a major facility that's under production, but that's for cement production from Germany. So that's the starting point here. When you move past that discussion, you move into, well, where will you take emissions? Well, what's happening is that the government of Canada is selectively picking Canadian oil production, not, as you point out, Eastern oil imports or transportation emissions or whatever. They're specifically targeting, in fact, the oil sands before that oil can be released. Now, when you add $16 to $24 billion onto your cost of production, before you build a $20 to $34 billion pipeline, you're looking at very significant penalties for Canadian Western producers.
Well, I won't ask you to go out on a limb and say how much per barrel this could add, because who knows?
Nobody knows. It's estimated between $100 to $200.
Okay, well, oil's about, I don't know, it was about $57 a barrel when I looked this morning.
It's down a lot.
So who is going to want to buy Alberta oil? We're at 57 plus.
Well, who could afford to produce that oil at those prices? That's the question, and carry that cost. And so, the government loves talking about stranded assets. If we're going to get out of oil, all of these facilities will be stranded assets. Well, let me tell you, this huge decarbonization project could be a gigantic stranded asset if the price of oil goes below where it is now. In fact, it's a very critical price point right now for all these plants. So how does this affect Canada? Well, if you can't export that oil, and there are estimates that these policies have cost Canada around $680 billion in capital that's fled the country over the last 15 years.
Say that again. How much?
$680 billion.
680, nearly
billion dollars.
Nearly $750 billion.
Indeed.
Between 680 to 750.
And that's just capital that's left by projects that haven't been built. If you look specifically at the numbers involved with some of the pipelines, for instance, these pipelines and the production from them that's going offshore is not only competing with oil that's coming in from Venezuela and the United States. I mean, of that, those imports to Eastern Canada, 72% originating in the United States. They have none of these penalties. So this idea that Canada is going to seek out markets because it has decarbonized oil, the question is, who's asking for that oil? No one that I'm aware of. No one is saying we need to have a premium for decarbonized oil over what's coming in from Venezuela.
So let me ask you this, Dr. Wallace. I mean, I hate to ask you to put yourself inside the liberal mind, but how do you think that they could ever justify that to themselves? We're talking about the smoke-filled room, the back room where everybody's sitting around. How are we going to, do you think we could ever stick it to the Alberta oil industry and not put something similar on importing oil from outside the country?
Well,
most people would say, no, you never get away with that, but they're getting away with it.
Well, as you said in your opening comments, we appear to have two oil policies in Canada, one for the East and one for the West. The East, unrestricted imports of any kind, which is taking vast quantities of money, as the numbers I cited are well over $500 billion over the last 20 or 30 years. So a very interesting thing happened this week. Bill Gates came out just in advance of the COP30 conference in Brazil and suddenly changed his position on global warming to say we're concentrating too much on emissions as opposed to practical solutions to cope with the warming. Now, this is a position that's been taken by scientists and ignored by the media largely for the last 20 years. This is a very significant commentary because what's happening is that the world is, there was a quote I saw that just this morning, the world is transitioning away from the energy transition. That is something that's putting the Carney government and the Canadian government in a very difficult position. The rest of the world is pivoting away from the idea that you can eliminate a hydrocarbon economy and an energy producing economy and replace it entirely with renewables. Just saying, look, we know that's now wrong. And now we're moving into a situation to say we have to focus on adaptation.
Well, you see, I mean, Bill Gates has been a very strong proponent of cutting carbon emissions to fight global warming. He has now recanted. Before he recanted, he was very quotable, as long as he said that. Right now, of course, everybody's, oh, well, you know, Bill Gates is a little old and hard, and maybe he's losing his grip. Well, but nobody's really picking up on that, and yet I think that's highly significant.
Well, it's tremendously significant, and the fact that he decided to make that announcement just before COP30, and you know, it's almost predictable. The UN conferences. This is the 30th conference now, and aside from the costs of jetting all these people to the Brazilian rainforest, well, to come back specifically to Canada, Canada has set out these emissions guidelines. Ever since 1998, Canada has not hit one of its objectives for emissions, not one. It's now looking like it's trying to double down on it and keep the myth that you can stabilize or reduce your emissions through decarbonized oil. The costs of this proposal, even though it's been looked at by industry as a viable option, it's not the question of whether or not we can do this. Engineers in Canada are more than capable of doing it, although the technology is unproven, and the largest comparable facility in Australia that's run by Chevron has never come even close to meeting its requirements. And so assuming it works, assuming that you spend that $16 to $24 billion, and assuming that there's a market for that oil at the other end, you still only bring down your emissions in Canada by less than 2%.
Oh, that happens. Really? Less than 2%?
Yes.
You do all that.
You do all that.
Because all the rest of us are driving our cars and we're breathing and exhaling. And
well, and the comment I heard from the Prime Minister that made me laugh the other day, he said, you have to realize that this decarbonized oil is going to generate enormous jobs and enormous industry within Canada. Well, it will. It's not going to be, if you're going to spend $16 billion, you're going to employ a lot of people. The point is, it never makes money. It's a constant negative impact, not only in operations, but on your pre-capital costs and on the penalty it imposes on the pipeliners and the oil producers who are going to have to pay for this. Now, the part that he's leaving out is that it is not the pipeliners and the producers and the federal government that's going to pay for this. This is going to probably land very heavily on the Alberta taxpayers, to the tune of between maybe $500 million to $1.4 billion a year to operate that facility.
Well, okay, let's talk about that, because there is a sort of an understanding, I think, that Premier Smith has, that, or hope, perhaps I should call it, that we will be able to develop the oil producing industry and have pipelines going to the coast and lift the tanker ban, as long as we can decarbonize the oil in the manner prescribed. Now, at the price of the decarbonized oil, nobody's going to want to buy it. We're not going to be able to afford to use it, even locally,
or sell it.
Yes. So two questions. First of all, is when you laid this out for the parliamentary committee, what did they make of it? And the second question is, do you think this grand bargain has got legs?
Yeah. Well, the parliamentary committee didn't ask me one question. The Conservative members did, but the Liberal members did not rise to the occasion. So, quite frankly, I know what Honourable David Bexty and his Tory colleagues thought of it, because they were asking me questions where I used these numbers. The Liberals, not so much. So I don't know what they're thinking about it. As for Premier Smith, I really congratulate her for trying so hard to find when she emerged from the Premier's meeting in January in Saskatoon and came up with the idea of a grand bargain where a new pipeline could theoretically pay for this and be a grand bargain, which meets the requirements of the federal government and Alberta's expectations for oil export and development. My only comment is that if you're going to spend between $16 and $24 billion, you need to do something more than a back of the envelope calculation. And that if in fact the federal government is presenting that as an alternative for Alberta, I think that Alberta government needs to look at this very, very carefully.
So the parliamentary committee, basically, you've had a chance to get the message out to more people on this interview than probably you have through the parliamentary committee, because the Liberals just wouldn't pick up the ball and play. Yeah. But if the grand bargain doesn't happen, what is the future of the oil and gas industry in Alberta?
Well, if you look at and you listen to what it's interesting to listen to the Prime Minister say that they've set up this new major projects office that's going to accelerate these projects. Well, that may be true. I mean, I don't think it's going to be that effective. They're paying people very significant amounts of money to make it work. I hope it does. But in effect, they're trying to countermand their own regulatory process and end run it. That's something that I find to be unique in any parliamentary democracy. If your legislative base is so formidable that it's preventing things, as has been documented, to the extent of the billions of dollars that have left Canada. If you would think it would be reasonable to change that legislative base rather than and run it.
Yeah.
So that's what we've chosen to do. But to come to your point, if in fact these projects are going to be built, they're not going to be built by the federal government. They may be funded in part by it, but they'll be built by industry and by private capital. And when you listen to the presidents of TransCanada and Enbridge, they're giving messages out very clearly that they're directing their money for capital investment into the United States. Now, they may be, in fact, looking at a potential project in Canada after the cancellation of Gateway. I mean, Enbridge had to eat, it's been reported, something like $1 billion when Cabinet unilaterally overruled the National Energy Board approval for Gateway. If you had to be a producer in a capital markets, as I said to the committee, would you be interested in investing in Canada when you had to build a $16 billion decarbonization project, then face $20 to $30 to $40 billion in pipeline costs, for which you would have to go through what's called a expedited regulatory review process when you've got Aboriginal communities and the Premier of British Columbia in completely opposing those ideas, and a tanker ban on the West Coast, which would allow you to transport that oil to market. Those are tremendously formidable barriers, and it explains why TransCanada, or TC Energy, and Enbridge the presidents are making very clear statements saying our money, our capital investments is going to the United States.
Well, I know some people are watching this and they're saying, this is all very interesting, but Mr. Carney said he was going to lift the emissions cap. So surely we don't have to do this anymore.
Well, he said that they wouldn't need it if they did all of the other things.
These things
that are all of the other things, which is the current suite of emissions and climate regulations that you've got to understand that there's the clean fuel regulations. This is the tanker ban. The list of regulations goes on and on. What he's saying is that we do all those things, then you won't need an emissions cap. Well, it's the same thing.
Yes.
It's the same thing, only different.
We're just about out of time, Dr. Wallace, but let me pitch something that's just really crazy, because all of this is crazy, so I can be crazy too. We've got the Trans Mountain expansion line out to the coast in BC. If it gets to be that Alberta oil becomes so expensive that we can't even afford it, never mind sell it to anybody else.
Right.
The industry goes down and we start reversing the flow and bringing imported oil in, just like they do in Eastern Canada, and bringing it up to Alberta through the TMX.
Well,
what do you think? Is that crazy?
Well, you'd have to reverse the line. That's a very difficult situation. But, Trans Mountain represents a very viable alternative for Canada to very quickly increase its export oil by simply optimizing that line, like Enbridge and TC Energy are presently doing. You don't need a new pipeline. You can optimize existing ones and get it there. Now, if you've got the only way you can optimize those lines is to buy, quote, decarbonized oil, then you've got a very difficult process.
Dr. Wallace, it's a funny world we live in, except that it's not really that funny, but that was an amazing article, and I think you're one of the first people to bring it to light. Thank you for doing that. And I think we may be having you back to talk about this as things develop. So thanks for coming on the show.
Thanks for having me, Nigel.
For the Western Standard, I'm Nigel Hannaford.